Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson and I'm a registered social worker with over 14 years experience and 5 years as a therapist. In this video I'm going to be talking about Dr. Keith Campbell. And so he is a clinical psychologist, professor that is quite well known in terms of the field, in terms of narcissism. I recently watched a lecture series on him on Peterson Academy and a recent interview with him on the Wizard podcast. In this video, I'm just going to talk about aspects of his model. He has different ways to conceptualize narcissism, and I thought it would be a helpful understanding for my audience to get an understanding of Dr. Keith Campbell and what he says about narcissism. He very much takes a social science lens to narcissism, very much backs it up by studies, and has different approaches and models to understand narcissism. He understands it from biological, cultural, as well as a parenting dynamic that occurs. And he talks about the notion of a chocolate cake. So in terms of when dating a narcissist, how it's like a chocolate cake. So it tastes good, but it leaves you empty later on and it makes you not feel really good.
You mentioned that narcissism is like chocolate cake in the book. What do you mean when you say that?
Yeah, so one of the questions you run into a lot, and I studied dating and narcissism for a lot of years, was people go, why would I date somebody who's narcissistic? Why did I end up in this relationship? Why did I vote for this person? What was it? Why did I date this person? I must be stupid. I must be a fool. But no, you're not stupid. You're a fool. So I kind of came up with what I call the chocolate cake model. Basically, if somebody gives you the choice, they're like, hey, do you want this chocolate cake or do you want to eat like this good salad, or some broccoli or chicken salad or something? Most people are like, yeah, the chocolate cake sounds good. And you eat the cake and you feel really good. You're kind of jacked from all the sugar. You're like, that's an awesome cake. And then like 20 minutes later, your energy drops, you get a sugar crash, you're depressed. And then you start doing self-recrimination. God, I ate that cake. What an idiot. What kind of idiot would eat a chocolate cake? I'm like, dude, I would. It's chocolate cake. It's the best. But people, then they beat themselves up like there's somehow they got tricked into eating cake. It's just the payoff matrix. And same thing when you meet this narcissistic guy, and I say guy all the time, it can be women too. It's just that when I hear men complaining about narcissism, it's usually in marriage. It's not dating, and women complain in dating as well, but it happens to both. But again, women more than men. Why did I date this guy? Well, let's see. He's attractive. He's self-confident. He presented himself as really successful. He's well-groomed. He had a fancy watch. And he told you he thought you were pretty awesome when he met you. Why wouldn't you have been attracted to him? That's an attractive guy. You didn't know he was cheating on you with 3 other people that he didn't tell you about. You didn't know he had a trail of people he had destroyed over the last 30 years. You didn't know that his mom thinks he's kind of a bad guy, and that's a bad sign. Because you don't know how he belittles the people at work that are beneath him because it builds his ego up. You don't see any of this stuff. All you see is this good-looking, confident dude, just like a piece of chocolate cake. So it makes perfect sense to start a relationship.
He views it not just as a disorder, but also personality traits that exist on a spectrum. So there's different ways that he looks at narcissism, but that's a gist of his general approach. So in terms of narcissism as a trait, Campbell explains like most personality traits, narcissism follows a normal distribution, with most people falling in the middle and fewer at the extremes. This kind of goes back also to the notion of the magnetic syndrome. So the fact that we have an underinflation of self or an overinflation of self. So that's to understand, I guess, the level of codependency versus narcissism. And according to him, Campbell, he talks about 2 main forms of narcissism. So there's grandiose narcissism. This is characterized by a sense of entitlement, superiority over others, to use them for their own self-esteem regulation, and often being energetic, charismatic, and socially effective. These individuals often seek leadership positions. So there's also the vulnerable narcissism. So this also involves entitlement and superiority, but is coupled with insecurity and defensiveness. These individuals are easily threatened or criticized, may harbor fantasies of grandiosity and revenge. They're more likely to seek psychotherapy due to the feelings of being overwhelmed, anxious, or depressed. So he makes a distinction between grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism. And then there's the narcissism personality disorder, so NPD.
We have two somewhat different descriptions of what a narcissist is. We have this more grandiose description, which is somebody who has a sense of entitlement, who thinks they're superior to others, who uses people to maintain their self-esteem, and also is energized, charismatic, rises into leadership positions, and tends to be socially effective. So that would be your grandiose narcissist who right now, they're all running for mayor of New York or whatever. I mean, that's your typical grandiose side. And on the other side, you have a more defensive kind of narcissist, the same I'm better than people, the same sense of entitlement, but rather than thinking I'm confident, I'm socially secure, it's I'm insecure, I'm looking out for people trying to threaten or criticize me so I can get defensive. So it's much more of a defensive form of narcissism where there's more of a fantasy of grandiosity. If people knew what a genius I was, then they would respect me.
So he describes NPD as an extreme form of narcissism that is inflexible and causes significant impairments of various areas of life, such as relationship, work, or finances. It often involves features of both grandiosity and vulnerability, and sometimes emotional dysregulation like narcissistic rage. And so in the interview I watched of him, he does talk about, so he actually was asked on this question, does it mean if someone's not good at their job or like narcissism is impairing their job, and that means they have NPD, versus the sense that he talks about the fact that they can be successful in their job. So it was an interesting question that the interviewer asked.
And I guess the distinction comes down to, for there to be a pathological disorder, there has to be impairment. That's where your argument boils down to that. And
yes,
so since he's president, that wouldn't qualify as a level of impairment based on that.
I mean, is it clinically significant impairment if the guy's life has led him to become a billionaire with a tower and a large family who seems to talk to him? His kids haven't all abandoned him, and they still seem to show up and look nice. Maybe it's just for the money. And he seems to function at his job reasonably well. People were worried he was going to nuke the world. He hasn't, he ran 4 years. He didn't nuke anybody. It was kind of narcissistic. I don't know if that's a disorder. It seems like it's kind of working for him. And you go, well, maybe now you could say why I'm wrong. Why I'm wrong is maybe he's causing such destruction from his narcissism. It's so terrible. And that's the destruction. Maybe Melania is being battered and abused behind the scenes. And Keith, you're so stupid and naive that you don't see what he is. Maybe his kids are being abused. Maybe this is all going on. And maybe he's run an operation on his kids where they're terrified and broken people. And that's possible. I don't see it, but it doesn't mean it's, you know what I mean? This is diagnosis from a distance, and that's why the Goldwater rule is psychiatrists shouldn't be doing this.
He also talks about the difference between overt and covert narcissism. So Campbell often uses overt synonymous with grandiose narcissism and covert with vulnerable narcissism. So that's interesting that he makes those combinations, whereas others might not. He notes that narcissistic traits of a vulnerable narcissist may be hidden initially by the presentation, like depression and anxiety. So these are the ones that are harder to spot, and typically they can present as being, depressed and also just having issues with anxiety. And then he also talks about the dark triad. So this is from the literature, and he talks about the dark triad of personality, which includes narcissism, psychopathology, and Machiavellianism, all sharing a quality of being a bit of a jerk, he talks about. And sadism was later added to the dark tetrad, so that's an addition that was made. And he also notes that borderline research suggests that vulnerable narcissism shares similarities with BTD, so borderline personality disorder, he says, shares similarities with vulnerable narcissism, revolving around the trait of neuroticism. So it's just interesting that a more vulnerable narcissist that has a level of neuroticism can have a close link to borderline personality disorder.
And have you seen this new research that says vulnerable narcissism is maybe more like borderline personality disorder?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of did that back in the day. So in sort of social personality psychology, one construct that people have come up with is the dark triad, and I think that's gotten you're nodding. I think that's gotten out there in the literature. I think people on TikTok are probably talking about the dark triad. And what that was Del Paulus, who's a professor up at British Columbia. He's like, we got narcissism. It's about sort of self-enhancing and being a bit of a jerk. We have psychopathy, which is about being sort of self-centered and maybe impulsive and a bit of a jerk. We have Machiavellianism, which is about being, manipulative and a little shady and a bit of a jerk. All those things seem to share being a bit of a jerk. So we'll call them a dark triad. And then they added sadism to it later. They kind of made a dark tetrad. I was with Josh Miller, who's a colleague, a clinician, and we were looking at this. We're like, well, isn't this the exact same with vulnerable narcissism and borderline, but it just revolves around the trait of neuroticism. So if you look at vulnerable narcissism, borderline personality, and maybe, factor 2 psychopathy, which is a little more of a less refined form of psychopathy, a little more impulsive form. Those three seem to hang together. So vulnerable narcissism does look a lot more like borderline personality. And you even see this in the clinical literature where it's, is it Kernberg's borderline conditions and narcissistic personality disorder? I get Kernberg and Cohen mixed up. They're both great influences on this field with K names. But they've thought about this historically as that this more vulnerable narcissism is almost like a more developed form of borderline personality. This is coming out of more of the psychoanalytic tradition.
And Sam Vatkin also speaks about the closeness of these categories. He talks about like the narcissist being like a failed borderline. So he actually sees the narcissist as being more semi-psychotic and less touch with reality, whereas and it's like a defense of borderline. And whereas borderline is, which he also says can be equal part like women and men, because often in the past we would talk about BPD being more with women, but at least from current research, it suggests that it's actually closer to half and half from my understanding. But yeah, it's just interesting that borderline personality, he links close to being vulnerable narcissists, or linking those as close. And as I mentioned, I watched his lecture series on the Peterson Academy. So he has an 8-part series, and he walks through all different aspects of narcissism in terms of dating, social media, the jobs, like in the work environment, and also just how like celebrity culture and this kind of thing. So he just talks about more from a social science lens. So I would consider it more of an outside-in perspective. So where someone like It's Not You book in terms of Dr. DeValzia and Sam Vatkin, they're more, I would say, orientated towards, of course, they speak about the science and the social science and the, outside-in perspective in terms of seeing it as a disorder. But they also, I think, do generally a good job of explaining the interior of both the narcissist and what it's like to be on the receiving end. Whereas I would take someone like Campbell as more of a social scientist, and he does obviously touch on the way in which he makes these people, like makes the people on the receiving end feel. But I think he's more emphasizing just like how this shows up scientifically and in like the social science data. And so that's just, I think, good to have that perspective, because he's just taking a more, I would say, outside-in perspective and more of a social science lens. But he does also talk about parenting and the biological element of narcissism.
So if you're a parent and you suspect maybe one of your children is a little bit narcissistic, you mentioned the CPR method for trying to help that situation. Could you go over that?
Yeah, so I get a lot of parents that are like, I don't want my kid to be narcissistic. What do I do? And my first thing I say is like, be a good role model and don't worry about your, 3-year-old running around naked. It's normal. Like it's normal for young kids to be pretty narcissistic. It's just, you know. But then parents want advice. So CPR is easy to remember. And what that stands for is compassion, passion, and responsibility. So if you think about buffering narcissism, the number one thing is compassion. If you feel compassion or love or connection to other people, that's like a natural buffer for your own ego. You cannot be that egotistical if you feel like you can't feel that much superior to others if you think they have souls just like yours. So compassion, like if you have somebody compassionate, even if they got a pretty big ego, they're not probably going to do that much damage, probably not be narcissistic. So people think about that. The next two are a little less obvious. Passion. People will go say, I want to be famous because then I'll get attention. Well, there's another way to get famous is do something you're really passionate about, whether it's rock climbing or playing sports or playing music or doing TikTok videos or writing books or whatever. And if you do it out of passion, you're going to feel good because when you act out of passion, you enter flow states, deep states of immersion, joy. It's going to be healthy for you. But as a side effect, people are going to start to gravitate towards you, because you're generating this passion and successful performance. So you get all the narcissistic attention you want, but you're not looking for it. It's a side effect. It's a side effect of just following your bliss, to quote Joseph Campbell, doing what you love. A life that's a passionate life rather than a life of seeking attention is probably healthier. A lot of research says that. And finally, responsibility taking is really important. Narcissists are really good at taking responsibility for success, there's like every success has 1,000 fathers and every failure has 9 items, some saying like that, but they blame everybody else for failure. So that this, in social psychology, we call this the self-serving bias.
So in terms of the roles of genetics, according to Campbell, this is about 40 to 60% of narcissistic people. He believes it's a biological element, with parenting playing a smaller role, more closer to 15 to 20%, and the rest being influenced by environmental factors. So that's typically what I've seen in the data in terms of a 40 to 60. Some say even higher. But at least according to recent studies and the current literature, people are suggesting it's closer to 40 to 60%. So I would say close to half if it's biology. And then, Campbell also talks about narcissism in society and culture. And so he talks about, in his book, he has the book, The Narcissism Epidemic, and he writes extensively in that book about the rise of narcissism in modern culture, particularly in the Western cultures. So we just think about social media and celebrity culture, reality TVs, reality shows. And so there's definitely an element of the notion of narcissistic type or narcissistic style. So just the way in which our society and youth and generations these days are putting more attention on themselves. And I know Sam Vakin talks about that too, and just in terms of, we used to all go to like a movie theater, right, and watch a movie together. And we still do, of course. But then it turned to the TV. So then it was just the family likely around the TV or like close friends. And then now it's mostly like we're all on our own screens, or we're playing perhaps multiplayer games, but that's typically from people online. But we're essentially looking, at our own screens now, and we're also looking at ourselves a lot, right? And social media also tends to reward narcissism, and there, people that put a lot of emphasis on their looks too can, sometimes be considered more narcissistic, but not necessarily. But it's just something as usually a cue or a sign sometimes that they might be narcissistic. He talks about narcissism in leadership. So he notes that grandiose narcissists are often drawn to have a successful and take a leadership position. So they tend to gravitate towards being successful and attaining leadership. They look for positions to come off as being confident. They have usually the energy for it and desire for power and status. He suggests a certain degree of callousness that some of these CEOs and top business types have, because in some sense, sometimes maybe you have to be callous. So there's also the notion of ego and the importance of that in terms of competing. So again, there's the notion of competitive strategies within, evolutionary biology and just in terms of us as a species. And so it's an adaptive strategy that could be argued for. And then there's notion with narcissism and celebrities. So research indicates that celebrities, particularly reality TV stars, he says, tend to have a higher degree of narcissism than the general population. Musicians, on the other hand, may at lower levels due to a need for cooperation with the band. And then there's also, again, mentioning social media. So narcissism and social media. Social media platforms are designed in a way to reinforce narcissistic behavior. And grandiose narcissists tend to have more followers and connections. However, successful influencers may also possess a high level of conscientious and worth ethic. So it's not just to say that just because you're on social media that you're necessarily narcissistic. And obviously in our day and age, a lot of people understand the importance of social media. So sometimes people that are more introverted or aren't necessarily narcissistic, in some ways to adapt and to be successful, you almost have to put yourself out there sometimes. And so it doesn't necessarily obviously mean that if you are on social media that you're necessarily narcissistic, but something just to pay attention to. So yeah, Dr. Keith Campbell, I would say, is just a good, refreshing perspective. I mentioned I watched his lecture series, and I found him on this interview in terms of the Wizard podcast that I watched. And I find that his, analogy to chocolate cake can be very helpful, and also the CPR method. So understanding parenting and how it influences narcissism, as well as just his biological, as well as environmental or social lens. So it's, I would say, very comprehensive in the way he looks at this. He sees it, I would say, more on a spectrum, and again, seeing it from a more clinical or social science lens. So in this video, I covered Keith Campbell in terms of his perspective on grandiose versus vulnerable narcissists, as well as his chocolate cake analogy in terms of attraction to a narcissist. I also talked about his CPR method for parenting, so the notion of compassion, passion, and responsibility, and just explained some of his analysis from it in the work environment, within social media, as well as celebrity culture. And so if you did like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks and have a great day.